The crimes of Jeffrey Dahmer often provoke a specific narrative, the idea of a sophisticated, calculating mastermind executing a flawless, predatory design. Conversely, the sheer severity of his acts, crude lobotomizations, splanchnophilia, and cannibalism, leads many to assume he operated in a state of complete psychosis, entirely detached from reality. Neither is accurate. A meticulous review of the forensic evidence reveals a critical distinction. Extreme clinical pathology does not automatically equate to legal insanity. To understand how 17 young men and boys were murdered over 13 years, we have to examine his developmental etiology, the specific institutional failures that shielded him, and the landmark trial that tested the rigid thresholds of criminal liability. We are forced to locate the exact threshold, separating an uncontrollable medical compulsion from a punishable, lucid intent. The result is a case study that maps the precise border between a severely sick mind and a legally responsible one. Forensic psychology requires strict categorization. Despite his presence in the cultural lexicon, Dahmer lacked the behavioral architecture of a classic psychopath like Ted Bundy. When we map their traits using Robert Hare's psychopathy checklist, stark divergences appear. Bundy relied on superficial charm, acute social agility, and a sadistic desire for power. Dahmer, by contrast, was severely withdrawn, socially awkward, and lacked a drive for sheer dominance. Furthermore, Dahmer repeatedly expressed deep self-loathing and remorse, characteristics completely absent in a true psychopath. This emotional turmoil requires us to look for a different diagnostic framework. The foundation of his pathology traces back to early childhood. At age 4, an invasive hernia surgery triggered profound dissociation, causing the child to retreat into an internal fantasy world as a defense mechanism against perceived trauma. This internal retreat was compounded by extreme emotional neglect. With an absent father and a highly unstable, hypochondriac mother, he failed to form secure bonds during his critical developmental years. This chronic instability manifested clinically as severe borderline personality disorder. The defining feature of BPD is an all-consuming, paralyzing fear of abandonment. For Dahmer, the terror of rejection was absolute. His extreme necrophilia was an evolution of this terror. A corpse represented the ultimate submissive partner, pliant, uncritical, and physically incapable of leaving him. This was complicated by a comorbid schizotypal personality disorder, which introduced severe paranoid ideation and delusional thinking. This disorder provided the cognitive framework for his horrific, crude attempts to create living, compliant zombies through chemical lobotomies. He did not murder to exert transient sadistic control. He murdered because his catastrophic attachment deficits demanded a permanent companion who could never abandon him. Yet, a pathological motive does not explain a 13-year span of impunity. Dahmer's ability to evade capture was the byproduct of acute law enforcement negligence and societal prejudice. This demographic visualization illustrates the explicit pattern in his victim selection. Of his 17 victims, the vast majority were young, gay men of Black, Latino, and Asian descent. He operated on a chilling predatory calculus. He deliberately targeted marginalized populations, recognizing that their disappearances were highly likely to be ignored or superficially investigated by the authorities. By 1990, his compulsions had escalated exponentially within the isolation of his residence at the Oxford Apartments in Milwaukee. The fatal consequences of systemic bias culminated on May 26, 1991. 14-year-old Konorak Sinthasampon, bleeding, heavily drugged, and naked, managed to escape Dahmer's apartment onto the street. 3 Black women found the severely injured child. Recognizing the immediate danger, they frantically called 911, explicitly requesting medical intervention. When police officers arrived, Dahmer calmly intercepted them. Exploiting the officers' evident prejudices, the articulate white man claimed the Laotian teenager was actually his adult lover, and they were simply having a domestic dispute. The officers accepted his narrative entirely. They actively dismissed the credible protests of the Black female witnesses, instructing them to be quiet, and waved off the arriving paramedics. Most critically, the officers escorted the boy back into Dahmer's apartment without running a standard background check. A single query would have revealed Dahmer was a registered sex offender, actively on probation for molesting Konarak's older brother. Within 30 minutes of the police leaving the apartment, Dahmer murdered the child. His violence was only stopped 2 months later when Tracy Edwards, facing a similar fate, feigned compliance, punched Dahmer in the face, and thought his way out to flag down a patrol car. The 13-year timeline demonstrates a grim reality. Institutional myopia and societal indifference function as an inadvertent shield for predators hunting marginalized citizens. Following his arrest, Dahmer waived his right to an attorney and freely confessed to all 17 murders. Because the physical acts were uncontested, the legal proceedings hinged entirely on a plea of guilty but insane. Wisconsin employs a bifurcated trial procedure. Having pleaded guilty in the first phase, the burden shifted to a civil phase, where the defense had to prove Dahmer suffered from a mental disease that rendered him unable to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct. The defense strategy relied heavily on narrative distance. By keeping Dahmer entirely silent and off the witness stand, they forced the jury to evaluate him strictly through the pathologizing lens of psychiatric experts. Defense psychiatrists argued that his severe necrophilia constituted a clinical mental disease. They posited that this disorder completely hijacked his behavior, transforming his horrific acts into an uncontrollable biological compulsion. The prosecution countered this framework through the testimony of renowned forensic psychiatrist Dr. Park Elliott Dietz. Dietz readily conceded that Dahmer was severely mentally ill. However, he systematically demonstrated that severe mental illness does not negate legal mens rea, the conscious cognitive intent to commit a crime. To dismantle the defense of uncontrollable compulsion, Dietz presented a three-pronged framework proving Dahmer possessed absolute cognitive control. The first pillar was preparation. Dahmer deliberately ground up triazolam sleeping pills well before he went out hunting, ensuring his chemical sedatives were ready to deploy immediately. The second pillar was risk mitigation. He actively avoided targeting men who owned vehicles, knowing that a car abandoned near his apartment would serve as an easily traceable breadcrumb for police. The final pillar was concealment. He utilized highly calculated methods to destroy evidence, including 57-gallon drums of muriatic acid, and he lied effortlessly to law enforcement, most notably during the Synthesome phone incident, to evade capture. The medical evidence of his pathology was indisputable, but the behavioral evidence showed a man who could meticulously plan, execute, and temporarily halt his criminal behavior to avoid detection. The jury concluded that Dahmer possessed the substantial capacity to conform his behavior to the law. They rejected the insanity defense, resulting in convictions carrying 941 years in prison. The verdict established a permanent precedent in forensic jurisprudence. A defendant can suffer from crippling paraphilic and personality disorders, yet still retain the cognitive faculties required for legal accountability. Dahmer's incarceration was brief. In 1994, he was bludgeoned to death with a metal bar by a schizophrenic fellow inmate, Christopher Scarver, while left unsupervised in a prison gymnasium bathroom. The trauma of the case echoed long after his death. Tracy Edwards, the man who heroically initiated the arrest, suffered a catastrophic psychological collapse, drifting into homelessness and eventually facing his own murder conviction 20 years later. Jeffrey Dahmer remains the definitive case study of how profound developmental attachment deficits can mutate into lethal necrophilic compulsions. Yet his extended ability to act on those compulsions serves as a permanent historical indictment, revealing how systemic prejudice allows violence to flourish unchecked.